The annihilation of 6 million Jews during the Second World War at the hands of the Nazis and their allies is without doubt one of the defining events of the 20th century. However, while the crimes of the Nazi regime are well known, the response of Jews who survived the war remains an active field of research. This month, we speak to Anna Guenter, who recently completed her MA thesis on Jewish revenge in post-war Vienna, and her thesis advisor, Dr. Sarah J. Panzer. I'm Jean Badgelan.
And I'm Patrick Needham.
And you're listening to Talking History. Miss Guenter, Dr. Panzer, welcome to Talking History.
Hi, thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
So what led you to this topic of research?
I think I came from it from two different directions, and those are, first of all, my interest in Vienna and Austrian history, which is very personally motivated because I moved to Vienna just after I finished my bachelor's, and with lockdown and Zoom classes, I became, I did a lot of long walks through the city of Vienna and got to learn a lot about its history and became very interested in it. And then the focus on Jewish revenge specifically developed due to an exhibition that I saw in Frankfurt in 2022, which discussed this topic in both like a literary form and historical form, and specifically looking at Jewish revenge after the Holocaust. And when I saw that exhibition, I thought about how this might have looked in Austria, and I was surprised to see that there had not been a lot of research done on this subject, or actually none, really. So that became kind of the guiding question for my thesis.
So your work focuses on post-war Vienna, which of course is the capital of Austria, and not Germany. And so when we think of the Holocaust, when we think of the annihilation of the European Jewish community, we think of Germany. But in focusing on Austria, you kind of reveal some of the difficulties about tackling the Holocaust and the remembrance of the Holocaust and the remembrance of the Second World War and the Nazi regime more generally in Austrian society. Because, of course, Adolf Hitler was Austrian. And Austria was one of the first countries to be occupied by the Nazis. So we have this kind of notion you talk about in your thesis of Austria being the first victim of Nazi aggression. Can you tell us how this figures into the remembrance of the Holocaust and, how the Austrian perception of the Second World War has shaped that? And if indeed this kind of idea that Austria was the first victim of Nazism is a sustainable idea for historians?
Well, so this idea of the first victim is actually a codified founding myth of the Second Austrian Republic, which was established after the war. And it claims that Austria itself and all Austrians were the first victim of Nazi aggression with the 1938 annexation of Austria into the German Reich. And obviously this is a very fraught narrative because it claims that Gentile Austrians, those that collaborated with the Nazi regimes, those that profiteered from it, all of these people were victims of Nazism. So it's simply not true. But up until the late 1980s, and there's a watershed moment that then overturns this founding myth, it was the premise of Austrian politics and of cultural remembrance, of memory politics, and basically the agreed upon compromise of the Second Republic. In 1986, this was challenged due to a political scandal with the ex-UN General Secretary of the United Nations. And this is when Austria starts to grapple with this myth and starts to challenge it more broadly. Of course, there are dissenting voices, especially from historians, researchers, victims of Nazi regime, and specifically of Austrian Nazis, that had challenged this myth before, but the broad consensus held up until the late 1980s. So I think this is really important to take into account when we look at Jewish responses to the Holocaust in Austria, because it takes place upon a fundamentally different trajectory than memory politics in Germany, which also obviously has its problems, but they are fundamentally different from Austria.
Could you expand on that a little bit, Dr. Panzer, about the differences between Austria and Germany in terms of their grappling with the Holocaust?
So the first thing that I would just say, and this is something I always tell my students, is that when you're talking about the annexation of Austria in 1938, the state that Anna already mentioned, I hate to break it to you, but The Sound of Music lied to everyone. That it was not this, everyone standing up singing Edelweiss in this sort of firm defiance of the Nazis, but actually the Austrians get on board with the Nazi project quite quickly. And Anna, you mentioned 1938. The sort of bookend dates or the bookend events we tend to think of in 1938, you mentioned already the annexation or the Anschluss. The other one is Kristallnacht, or the pogrom on November 9th, which, as you point out in your thesis, is also really important in thinking about how quickly the Austrian public and the Austrian state adopts and even radicalizes the anti-Semitic policies that are happening elsewhere in the Reich. And so I was wondering if you could comment a bit on the pogrom and how that shows the trajectory of violence within Austria itself.
Well, I think, I'm glad you pointed that out, because it's not, I think, very often discussed part of the Holocaust more broadly, because the events that took place after the annexation by Germany and Austria are so incredibly violent that they are often narrated as kind of a precursor to the Reichskristallnacht, which takes place half a year later in Germany and also in Austria. But the Anschluss itself, the pogroms that take place in Vienna specifically, are so incredibly violent that there are actually German Nazi officials stepping in and commenting on the rampant anti-Semitic violence that is taking place in the streets of Vienna. So it is kind of almost absurd to look at these sources and then see that at this point German Nazis were still very preoccupied with keeping up a semi-formal ostracization, marginalization, and disenfranchisement of the Jews. So they did not agree with the open violence that was taking place in Austria. But of course, later the rest of the German Reich catches up to this violence, but it is definitely foreshadowed by the violence that is taking place after the Anschluss in Austria.
So basically, we see, pogroms against Jewish people in a kind of disorderly fashion taking place in Austria prior to similar events taking place in Germany. Not that the Nazis particularly cared about Jewish people, but as a kind of authoritarian state project, they wanted to maintain control of that violence, whereas in Austria, their issue was not so much that Jews were being persecuted, but they were being persecuted independently of state action.
It functions a bit both ways, because there had also been spontaneous, sporadic, informal violence in Germany directed against Jewish communities through the 30s, which is something that more recent scholarship has revealed. But what you see in Austria is almost that process accelerated in a much more compressed span of time. And so whereas sort of the radicalization that had happened in Germany had taken 5 or 6 years to get to that point, in Austria it's unfolding within 6 months. And also in Austria you have a systemization of violence and expropriation that also takes Germany a bit longer to catch up on. And the key figure here, I think, who you talk about, is Adolf Eichmann, another Adolf, which some people may be familiar with because of the trial in Israel in 1961. But you talk a little bit about Eichmann and the model that he sets up for expropriating Jewish property. And so I was wondering if you could expand just a little bit on that.
Well, Adolf Eichmann is sent to Austria to kind of oversee this process of getting the Jewish inhabitants of Austria and of Vienna specifically out of the country. And this is supposed to be a model that is then reapplied back to the German Reich itself. And this works so successful that it is then termed as the Vienna model and exported back to everywhere where the Nazis have occupied different countries. Because basically what Eichmann does is he forces the Jewish existing communal structures into taking part in this process. He gives them the idea that they can still get out by paying a lot of money, by ratting on the elderly and the sick. And so still a large percentage of the Jewish inhabitants of Vienna get out. It's almost unprecedented of compared to other places. How many Jews survive after Nazi occupation of Austria. But it is also an incredibly brutal system that exploits the Jewish community and takes advantage of these communal structures, which after the war turns into accusations of collaboration against the Judenrate, the Jewish councils, is used as a model for the rest of Germany.
And the Jewish community in Vienna is a particularly large community as well. You mentioned in your thesis it's some 200,000 people in Vienna itself.
Well, it is 200,000 for all of Austria before Nazi annexation. But in Vienna, it is 177,000. So it's, the absolute majority of Jews live in Vienna.
Okay. So one of the central themes of your thesis is this concept of Jewish revenge after the war. Can you talk about what you mean by revenge? Because when I read your thesis, it was not precisely what I'd expected when you hear a word like revenge. So can you talk about what you mean by revenge?
Well, I think, first of all, what comes to mind is this image from Inglourious Bastards of Jewish revenge, of going around with a baseball bat and physically hurting Nazis. And in research, there's a more complicated and nuanced version of that. Laura Jokusch, a professor at Brandeis University, has kind of set up a framework for Germany that I worked off of. And it distinguishes between direct revenge, which are these physical acts of revenge, and symbolic revenge. And symbolic revenge is a rather broad term that encompasses everything from boycotting German products, documenting Nazi crimes, and also reestablishing Jewish life after the Holocaust, making sure that Jewish survivors have a lot of children, that they continue keeping up traditions, and so on and so forth. And in my research, I was definitely looking for acts of direct revenge because I think they're the most sensationalist, but I found a lot more of symbolic revenge.
And in this sense, it's kind of challenging an image of Jews during the Second World War and after the Second World War as kind of just passive victims of Nazi violence. I mean, one of the things you point out in your thesis is that very often, the crimes of the Nazi regime are narrated through the perpetrators of those crimes rather than through those who suffered them. And in a sense, Jewish people during the war and after the war aren't given any agency, but revenge is a kind of, even if it's this symbolic revenge, is a kind of retaking agency. Would you say that's kind of fair assessment of it?
Yes, absolutely. That was definitely what I was hoping to achieve with my thesis, because obviously this narrative of the passive victim has been challenged quite a lot in recent decades, and we've taken a step back from that. But I still think it's often the default narrative of the passive victim. We're working off perpetrator records, and we're questioning survivor accounts. Are they remembering it correctly? Are they very subjective? So I think laying the focus on the victims and narrating their stories through their own voices is a really important contribution to research.
And I think to go to this question of agency and restoring agency to the victims and survivors, the sort of mirror image of this, which Anna alluded to, is this question of Jewish resistance, that for a long time, Jewish resistance was seen in a rather reductive way of, why didn't they have guns? Why didn't they shoot people? And recent scholarship has complicated what exactly it means to resist, and that resistance is not simply through violence. And I think revenge is sort of the mirror image of that, right? Because whereas we tend to see resistance as an inherently good and noble thing, revenge is something that we tend to associate with very different emotions and with very different senses of morality and ethics and all of that. And so I wonder how you sort of grapple with the ethics of revenge.
I think that's a very good but also very complicated question. I think, as with everything in this research field, I think there's a lot of nuance. I mean, as I've pointed out, there's not this one type of revenge. So there's definitely differences. And in the cases that I've looked at, I think revenge can be seen as something very empowering and very restorative. It is not this inherently negative thing that seeks to just destroy or disrupt society or post-war Austria, but it actually seeks to grapple with the crimes of Nazism and the injustice that these victims have suffered, and also the injustice that continues after the war, because there is no restoration of property, there's no paying reparations. So revenge is a coping mechanism for this trauma and this injustice.
So one of the things that I found very interesting, you point out in your thesis, is that, for example, some of the Holocaust survivors, you mentioned the example of Ruth Kluger, who had her memoirs published, but the memoirs were edited with the sections where she talks about revenge being redacted. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what it tells us about the Austrian attitude towards the Holocaust? Because it strikes me as very interesting that they would redact part of what is an account from a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust.
Well, this example specifically is taken from Carolyn Dean's book on the moral witness, is what it's named. And she talks about the genealogy of witnessing crimes, witnessing genocide, and how our perception and treatment of these survivors of like incredible brutality and mass atrocities has changed over time. And tying into Ruth Kluger's the redaction of her memoirs, initially, or I think still up to this day, we have this perception of Holocaust survivors as inherently moral, as these benchmarks of how to behave, and they have suffered all of these tremendous atrocities and brutality, and have become not better persons necessarily, but definitely someone to look up to who can teach us something about human behavior and human morals.
Almost a sanctification, and that gets into this whole other question of how memory of the Holocaust, particularly in the U.S., has been often framed in a Christian lens as opposed to a Jewish lens. And one of the things that I like about your project is you explicitly reframe this question of revenge back in the Jewish tradition.
I try to work a little bit with the religious understanding of Jewish revenge too, and obviously I think that is a dissertation project in and of itself. But revenge occupies a very different role in Jewish understanding as opposed to like our Christian understanding of it. And we can see that still in Jewish holiday traditions today, such as the Purim story about celebrating Jewish revenge as a way to save the Jewish people from genocide. So revenge actually becomes this very empowering tool to save Jewish life.
So the redaction of references to revenge in this memoir is, in a sense, because revenge, or speaking about revenge, complicates this image of Holocaust survivors as pure moral victims?
Yeah, so there's this very famous essay by Primo Levi, arguably one of the most famous Holocaust survivors, The Gray Zone, in which he talks about these very simplistic moral narratives we like to carry in our head about the Holocaust, about victims versus perpetrators. And his whole point is that both perpetratorship is a spectrum, but also the very act of being a survivor was in some ways a ethically compromising one, that it was not possible to be a survivor and to be a saint. And he raises this sort of specter of Anne Frank, this sort of perfect victim, as it were. And I think that's precisely the problem with Holocaust narrative memory, is that we looked at Anne Frank, this teenage girl, as sort of a perfect victim, and every other victim or every other survivor who doesn't fit that model becomes more difficult for us to grapple with. And so there is this attempt to try to strip away the messiness of the Holocaust in order to restore victims and survivors to this sort of moralistically pure image we carry in our heads. And of course, even Anne Frank was not the perfect victim that she sometimes appears. There's this whole debate, controversy around her father, Otto, and his own redaction of her diary, in which he removed references to sexuality, to her body, to puberty, as a way of, I think very understandably preserving a certain image of his little girl. But that also carries over into broader narratives about the Holocaust that I think, as difficult as they are to talk about, we have to engage with honestly.
In your thesis, you examined the case study of one Hilda Z. Who was she, and how did she cope in a post-war Austria?
So Hilda Z, I love talking about her because I think she's just a very fascinating case study. She was an art historian who moved to Vienna when she was still very young from the larger Habsburg Empire. And she really understands Vienna as this intellectual capital of the world that she really longs for, but that is never really fulfilled in the time that she lives there. So she trains as an art historian and tries to work just before the annexation of Austria by Germany, and has a lot of trouble already finding a job because of anti-Semitic resentments against Jewish people. She then leaves Austria just before 1938 due to this inability of really finding a footing in the academic or larger art history world in Vienna. She goes to Egypt and becomes a university lecturer there and teaches on Coptic art. And when the war breaks out, she has to enter into a fake marriage to secure her stay in Egypt. But then she lives there for, I think, about 20 years and really finds her new home there. She tries to return to Vienna briefly after the war, but is incredibly disappointed by what she finds and basically leaves just after a few weeks to return back to Egypt. So she has basically resolved to never to return to Vienna, but is then forced in 1967 to forever leave Egypt due to the Six-Day War between Egypt and Israel and her being a Jew. So when she returns to Vienna for the second time in 1968, she is incredibly hateful, I want to say. She does not want to come back to Vienna. She does not see any prospect there, and she starts hatching these first plans for revenge. Long story short, she then can escape Vienna one more time by becoming a lecturer in Canada. And once that job terminates, she returns to Vienna for the last and final time, and again rehatches these fantasies of revenge.
How typical were these stories of Hilda Z? Many survivors of the Holocaust that emigrated to Israel following the establishment of the State of Israel. Why did she return to Vienna, a place that seemed to have so many painful memories for her?
I think that is the key question that kind of narrates her whole story, because she expresses at every turn that she does not want to come back to Vienna, that she thinks Vienna is a city that has been destroyed by the Nazis, but also by the Austrians and Austrian Nazis. And she longs for a place that has never really existed, I want to say, because she romanticizes this fin de siècle intellectual Vienna. But she is always forced to come back to Vienna due to external circumstances, because she can't stay in Egypt because she is Jewish. She does not have any kind of relationship with Israel because she does also not consider herself she's not religious. She doesn't have any family there. And her other states, like Canada, is always tied to an employment. So once she no longer has that employment, once she gets closer to the age of retirement, Vienna is really this only place that she can return to, even though she does not consider it to be her home.
In conclusion, then, what are the next steps for your research?
Well, I hope to continue this subject of Jewish revenge in Austria, because I think I've barely scraped the surface of it. I've only looked at one archive, one type of source. So I think there's a lot more that I would like to do with that. So eventually I'm hoping I can pursue that with a PhD.
Thank you for joining us for Talking History, a presentation of KSMU and the Missouri State University Department of History. Catch us every first Thursday at 12:06 after NPR News. Our conversation about the Holocaust continues on our podcast, Talking History Extra, available along with our entire back catalog at ksmu.org or wherever podcasts are found. Welcome back. This is Talking History Extra from ksmu.org.
So we're here with Anna Guenter and Dr. Sarah Panzer, continuing our conversation about the Holocaust. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about, Anna and Sarah, is about the history of emotions. Now, the theoretical framework you approach your research through is this concept of the history of emotions. Can you talk about what that means as an approach, and how do historians go about understanding the internal world of Holocaust survivors, or anyone really, when we're talking about trying to understand emotions?
Well, as I understand it and as I've used it in my thesis, the history of emotions is kind of not the opposition to more empirical research or like the hard established facts, but it is something that complicates our understanding of traditional historical narratives, because I think for a very long time we've tried to push out emotions from writing history because they're conceived as not very empirical, very subjective, and also not working within this framework of like where we have a modern understanding of how history works and how our societies work. So I'm trying to tap into emotions of Holocaust survivors as kind of a way to explain cultural and societal processes that are maybe hard to understand if we don't look at emotional responses, because I think emotions guide a lot of decisions, even if we don't want to admit to it, even if we're not consciously aware of it.
And often I think we counterpose the idea of emotion and rationality, which, if you ask me, is probably a product of everybody watching Spock on Star Trek, as if like emotions and rationality are these two separate things that can't go together. How would you respond to that? How do you think people should think about emotions and rationality in the historical process, Dr. Panzer?
So this is a very long tradition in the Western philosophical, and I'm speaking exclusively for the Western philosophical tradition here because you see very different models of this being worked out elsewhere in the world. But this really goes back, like everything else in European history, to the Enlightenment, where you have this sense of a new model of human psychology, a new model of humanity being introduced, in which, or rather is premised on this idea that humans are innately rational, that if given the freedom to choose, if given the opportunities to educate and improve themselves, they will inherently act in rational ways. And that presupposes that everything that had been irrational, that had been deemed irrational in the past, was in some ways symptomatic of a lack of freedom or a lack of opportunity for education, that it represented an infringement on human liberty, and that if people were simply allowed to be themselves, they would choose the rational path. And that is the model that you see more or less imposed intellectually, culturally, politically across the 19th century into the 20th century. And it is coupled with this teleological framework of history in which it is presupposed that history is inevitably progressing and improving towards some distant future. And you see this in liberalism, you see this in Marxism. All of these different models presuppose that history is marching everward towards some great, glorious future. To frame it slightly differently, you see a version of this in the 20th century with Martin Luther King's famous quote, one of the three that people actually remember, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. It's all that basic idea. And that model of inevitable progress, that model of human rationality as innate and dominant, is called into question and is challenged in a very existential way by the Holocaust. And it's really the Holocaust that introduces a very big question mark into that entire epistemological structure. That if humans are allowed to act rationally, if humans are allowed to act free, they will choose the rational, good, moral choice. And what Nazism and what the Holocaust reveals is that that's not always the case. And so if for those of the listeners who are sort of philosophically inclined, this introduces postmodernism, this introduces all of this very real doubt about the philosophy that had been animating the Western world for the last 200 years. And so when we talk about the Holocaust, it is in itself a transformational historical event, but it has all of these other reverberations into how we think about human nature, how we think about the world, how we think about history.
Well, this is something I kind of want to follow up on with you, Dr. Panzer, you, I believe it was last year or earlier this year, attended a conference on teaching the Holocaust and trying to teach it in a respectful and appropriate way. And I think a lot of people and a lot of perhaps high school teachers who do come across this topic, perhaps inadvertently, teach it in a way that reinforces perhaps some of these negative stereotypes about the Holocaust and Holocaust victims as being passive and these perfect victims. And, a lot of, this teaching comes down to, looking at really grotesque images of people being brutalized in the most inhuman ways in Nazi concentration camps, or you have the images of the Kristallnacht and images of Jewish people being forced to scrub the streets, being victims of violence. How can we go beyond these kind of tropes of the Holocaust and of Holocaust victims when we are teaching these topics, these very difficult topics where there is enormous amounts of barbarity, inhumanity, but we want to create a deeper understanding of how and why these events happened, and not just look at them as a kind of look at how terrible humans can be and look at these poor victims suffering at the hands of this barbarism, but actually try and grapple with these historical events. How do we do that in a respectful way?
So I think the first thing that we have to be very conscious of and very careful about is the types of sources we're using. And this is something Anna already mentioned. And she talks about in her thesis this question of whether the sources we're using, and you mentioned images as well, whether they are created by perpetrators or by victims. So most of the famous photographs we have associated with the Holocaust that are in some way representing or depicting the violence of the Holocaust were made by Nazis and their collaborators. And there is this assumption by many people that photos and photography is in some way an objective reflection of the world, when in fact we know that that's not the case. That photos are framed, they are an intentional, not reflection of the world, but constructed image. That you are, when you take a photo, you are framing the image so that there are certain things that appear in the photo and a lot of other things that don't appear in the photo. And so we can't take photography at face value. And so when we use photos, we also have to be conscious of who made those photos and for what purpose. And so for myself, I think photos are very useful in the classroom in certain contexts, but I am also very conscious about using photography associated with perpetrators in speaking about the Holocaust, because there is a question about whether you're playing into these sensationalized narratives. And so that's something that I think people have to be very conscious of. I think one of the other things we have to be very aware of, because of the context in which we're operating, is the popular media that students are coming into the classroom with. That whatever we talk about the Holocaust and however we teach the Holocaust, students are inherently coming in with all of these other references and all of these other images that they get from popular media, from the internet. And so you also have to be aware and be able to work through those.
So, I think a lot of people who, even if they're not super familiar with the discipline of history, will be aware that you need to have a kind of hermeneutics of reading documents. You need to know who the author is, who they are writing for, what the purpose of the document is. But they don't consider that when looking at photos, because they view photos as just being kind of out there as an objective reflection of reality, when, of course, we all know that photos can be doctored, photos can be misleading, et cetera, et cetera. So you would caution against using images created by Nazis of the Holocaust.
Well, I think you can use those images, but you have to preface any discussion of those images with the recognition of authorship, purpose, intentionality, all of that. So just to give one example, I think one of the most famous images associated with the Holocaust, and this is one that I'm sure everyone can sort of conjure up in their head, is this very iconic image of this very little boy, I think 7 or 8 years old. He's wearing short pants and a hat, and he's got his hands up, and he looks terrified. And everyone can sort of immediately picture that image in their head because it is such an iconic photograph, but most people don't know the context in which that photo was created. So that photo actually comes from the so-called Stroop Report, and this was a collection of documents, but also photographs taken as part or in the course of putting down the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And so they actually had photographers that would accompany the SS men taking photographs, and then they were arranged into a photo album and sent back to Himmler as a present. And so this album and these photos, they look like they're spontaneously shot. They look like they are unstaged, but they're anything but the case. We know that these photos were often taken multiple times. We know that this was very much an intentional construction of events meant to serve a very specific purpose. And so that's not to say that we can't use these images, but we have to preface it with context about what these images were doing in the context in which they were created and how we can responsibly respond to them.
So you mentioned that, students who come to learn about the Holocaust, come with preconceptions. I teach Middle Eastern history. Very often students come with no understanding of the Middle East or very limited understanding. They don't have so many preconceptions that need to be challenged. But today, obviously, you have the History Channel, which is basically Romans and Nazis all the time. You have popular media. I think a lot of people's image of the Holocaust has been shaped by, for example, Schindler's List.
Not anymore.
Not anymore.
The last time I taught the history of the Holocaust, I only had one student in the class who had seen Schindler's List. But that student or that movie is now too old for most students.
So
now it's Boy in the Striped Pajamas, the single worst Holocaust movie ever made.
So can you talk a little bit about popular culture and the Holocaust, and what movies would you recommend for people? I know when we were talking just off air, you mentioned Inglourious Basterds. Again, Anna mentions Inglourious Bastard in her thesis about Jewish revenge, and you made the interesting comment that you said, compared to, let's say, The Sound of Music, it is more historically truthful than The Sound of Music, which presents an image of Austria as this kind of country resisting Nazi occupation. Can you talk about what you mean by that? Because for people who haven't seen Inglourious Basterds, it's kind of a counterfactual what-if history where a group of American servicemen and some Jewish people go and murder Hitler at a music concert, was
Movie
it?
theater.
At a movie theater. And obviously that didn't happen. But what do you mean by it being historically truthful compared to other movies?
So I think there's a tendency, and this goes back to the very specific position that the Holocaust occupies in contemporary memory culture. There's this tendency to think about the Holocaust in these very sort of black and white, dour, sort of quasi-objective terms where Holocaust movies are inevitably positioned as serious films. And I think, we can understand why. And you certainly, there's a whole different question about whether a Holocaust movie can be a comedy, which gets into some very sort of difficult moral and ethical questions if anyone has ever seen Life is Beautiful, for example. But there's a tendency to want to present and represent the Holocaust as accurately as possible, and I think the ultimate example of this is Schindler's List, where you had Steven Spielberg invest all of this time, all of this money. They actually shot on location in Poland at Auschwitz. They went to all this trouble to make the movie as historically accurate as possible. That said, and I'm prefacing this by saying that I do think there's a lot that's very important about Schindler's List, that contemporary Holocaust scholarship would not be what it is today without Schindler's List. However, all movies have a narrative, and the narrative of Schindler's List does open itself up for some very real questions by scholars in how it represents Jews, how it represents the position of Gentile rescuers, this question of Schindler as being the protagonist. It's not a perfect film. And on the other hand, there are films like Inglourious Basterds, which take considerable liberties with the history, but I think which actually have as much to say and as much to contribute to our understanding of this history as movies that are presented and represented as historically accurate. And so just to give another example, another movie that I really like, there's a movie that came out maybe about decade, 15 years ago now, The Gray Zone by Tim Blake Nelson. It's based on this essay by Primo Levi that I mentioned earlier. And one of the interesting choices that Nelson as a director makes in that film is that he has a cast of mostly American actors, and he allows them to speak in their own voices. So rather than this sort of, I think, very, Oscar baity, everyone is going to speak in this British accent, everyone speaks in their own voices. And so you have this very weird disconnect of watching a movie about the Holocaust in which everyone is speaking with like a New Jersey or New York accent. So Harvey Keitel plays an SS officer, and you can sort of imagine the disconnect there. And yet, I think as far as Holocaust movies go, it's one of my favorites. So it is not a movie that's trying to be historically accurate, but I think it is a movie that is historically truthful. Have you seen?
I have not.
It's worth checking out. I will just say it is an incredibly brutal movie. It is not a movie with a happy ending. This is another issue we could get into, this tendency to want to inscribe some sort of happy, redemptive ending onto the end of Holocaust movies. And the reality is there is nothing redemptive about the Holocaust. There is no happy ending. There is nothing to be learned from the Holocaust. And in that respect, I think also the gray zone in particular is very good.
I mean, I think the point about the accents is an interesting one because it's an interesting directorial kind of decision, but it makes sense because by giving people funny accents, as it were, you're kind of removing those people from the people you know from day to day. Whereas by giving them normal accents, letting them speak in their own accents, letting them speak in American accent shows that, you know, these were normal people committing these crimes. We don't have this distance created by the stereotypical evil, generic Eastern European accent or the movie British bad guy accent. I mean, it makes me think of Death of Stalin as another good movie, which I think says perhaps captures something more truthful about Stalinist era Soviet Union than kind of grim movies. It captures the absurdity of the totalitarian state where everybody's kind of joking around but 1 minute away from getting kind of liquidated, but also it's just an absurd situation. And I think people who have actually been and lived in authoritarian countries realize that actually a lot of what we talk about as totalitarianism and great kind of gray inhumanities, it's not like 1984. It's not like the movie adaptation of 1984 where it's all just very dour and grim, but it's absurd. And it captures that kind of absurdity where, and as you point out, the use of like normal accents, Harvey Keitel as an American accented SS officer alerts us to this. This is just a normal guy, right? If this was happening in New Jersey, this is how your SS officers would sound. If you're a German speaker, this is the kind of way that it would understand to you. It reminds me actually again of the British TV series Eurotrash, where when they did the dubs of the foreign of the people talking about their experiences, instead of doing it in a kind of BBC English accent, they had people with regional accents, which showed these are just normal people. They aren't some special, different humans from us. Because I think accents, do a lot of work behind the scenes in telling us who a person is.
Yeah, and I think you also see that with some of the other stylistic choices. So again, to pick on Schindler's List, the device of framing it or of filming it entirely in black and white allows for that distance, right? That this happened somewhere else, this happened safely in the past, this happened, over there. And I think you're exactly right that we prefer, when representing events like the Holocaust, to think of it as distant and as alien and as foreign to us as possible. At the same time, I think we also do have to recognize that the experience of life in the camps and at the killing centers was fundamentally unprecedented in very real and meaningful ways. And you see this in every memoir by a survivor, that there was no way of being ready for a place like Auschwitz, because Auschwitz was literally like nowhere else on earth. And so just to put forward another film that people might be interested in seeking out on sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, Son of Saul, a Hungarian film from several years back, is very mannered and very stylized in its presentation. So it focuses specifically on one individual, and the way that it's shot, you see the individual, he is at the center of the frame, and then everything sort of happens in the periphery. And so it's a very different way of representing the Holocaust, but I think also very, very effective in its way. And one of the things I think in thinking about Holocaust media that makes it unique is that it is so experimental. And so there's this new movie coming out, I think it's already out in theaters. in actual civilized parts of the country, zone of interest based on the Martin Amis novel, which also takes a very stylized approach to representing the Holocaust. And so you do have all of these different, very experimental modes of representing this singular event. And I think, going back to Anna's thesis, you see something very similar in the historiography, where I think, in many respects, the historiography of the Holocaust is more creative and more experimental than the historiography of most other topics, just because it necessarily has to be, because it is such a unique event. Of course, all historical events are unique. There are other genocides. There's some very good work positioning the Holocaust within the history of genocide. But in certain respects, the Holocaust is something that requires a very different form of engagement than even historians are used to working with.
Well, that's all we have time for this month, but Ms. Guenther, Dr. Panzer, thank you so much for joining us on Talking History and sticking around for Talking History Extra. We will catch you all next month at the same bat time, at the same bat place on Talking History.